Hello, this is a lecture on nutrition guidelines and choices. I am Professor Lou with Carolina University, so let's get started. Why do we eat the way we do? This is an important question as we begin our study of nutrition. There are four major categories of influence I would like to talk about today. They are also outlined in your book, which is Discovering Nutrition by Insel. And those categories are personal preferences, sensory influences, emotional and cognitive reasons, and environmental influences. So let's start with personal preferences. When babies are born, they are open to trying new foods. And then when babies become preschoolers and they grow, they are less interested in trying new foods. They experience a period of food neophobia where they do not want to try new things. Then as they become school-age children, they tend to accept a wider array of foods. And then as teenagers, they are strongly influenced by the preferences and habits of their peers and often adopt those. So by the time we are adults, we have a core group of foods that we prefer. So our personal preferences definitely impact what we choose to eat. Next is sensory influences. Sensory influences are things like taste, smell, texture, and then also flavor, which is an experience that's collective and is taste and smell together. So the two together, a combination. So people can have different ideas about how their senses respond to food and how that impacts what they eat. For example, someone might prefer crispy, chewy, or smooth. They might reject grainy, slimy, or rubbery foods, and that can be different for individuals. Like some people might prefer a grainy food. There can also be preferences for choices in color, moisture, and temperature based on the sensory experience. An example of this would be MSG is a food additive that's used to improve the flavor of foods because people like the way it tastes when it's added to foods. And so that's an example of a time that cooks and manufacturers are trying to improve the sensory experience so people will eat their food more often. Then we have emotional and cognitive reasons. That's our third overarching category of why we eat what we do. And that has several subcategories of emotional and cognitive influences. The first one is habits. We form habits. How we eat is habitual, and those habits can be hard to change. The habits, we develop those over time based on many things, and we just get in the habit of doing it. We're used to it. That's what we usually do. So if I get up in the morning, I have habits about what I eat. I just do. It's what I'm going to do every day, probably. Then we have comfort and discomfort foods. So there's a desire for a particular food based on behavior or motives, and that's a comfort or discomfort food. Like if you are used to having chicken noodle soup every time you get a cold or the flu, then you're going to associate that with comfort if it's helped you in the past to feel better. And so that comfort feeling just keeps getting reinforced as you eat that food when you have a cold or the flu. That's a comfort food. The discomfort foods are basically the opposite. So comfort and discomfort foods is a factor in the emotional cognitive reasons. So food advertising and promotion is next as a subcategory under emotional and cognitive reasons. So there are billions of dollars spent every year on food advertising. An example would be if there's direct advertising on the internet or on television, or if there's a soda can in a movie that the character drinks the soda can. Often the soda company has paid for that character to drink that particular soda. So that's a form of advertising and promotion. Why do companies do advertising and promotion with food items? Because it works. We often change our behavior based on those, and it affects our food preferences and why we eat what we do. Next, we have eating meals prepared outside the home. That's become more and more common. It's difficult sometimes to eat healthy outside the home because the food that's available outside our homes is more likely to be pre-prepared and ultra-processed. So we spend about half of our food budget these days on foods prepared away from home. We underestimate the amount of calories and fats in those foods. We don't know as much about what's in them, and that's likely to be contributing to weight gain and obesity in our society. Next is a subcategory under emotional and cognitive reasons. We have food and diet trends. So when a food becomes trendy, it's becoming popular. And an example of this would be in the 1980s, there was a low-fat food trend. This was to help decrease heart disease, and the low-fat food trend resulted in many foods being sold and packaged as reduced fat, low-fat, or fat-free products. Then we had another trend that was based on carbs, low carbs, and so we had foods being sold as low carb and no carb. Another example would be gluten-free foods. Now, there are people that are supposed to eat gluten-free. They can't tolerate gluten, and those are people that have celiac disease. But it also became a trend where people that didn't have celiac disease and had no real reason to eat gluten-free began eating that way. So food and diet trends really make an impact on the choices we make. Next subcategory under emotional and cognitive reasons are social factors. So social factors exert a powerful influence on food choice. Food is often at the center of family gatherings, social events, and office parties, and we will eat differently when we're in those situations. Think about the last big holiday you went to with extended family. You made different food choices than usual. There are social pressures, and there can be restrictions of food intake and selection during those times. Next subcategory under emotional and cognitive reasons is knowledge of health and nutrition. So many people select and emphasize certain foods they think are good for them. And when they get more education or information, they can adjust. So they can also perceive a health risk or benefit. So when they get knowledge of health and nutrition, they often can have that influencing what they eat, influencing why they eat what they do. So next we're going to go to the final overarching category, and that's environment. So under environment, we have a subcategory of economics. So economics plays a major role in what people choose to eat. What they can afford to eat is a major factor. Is the food cost going up? And is that causing them to not be able to get the same food product? Well, that will impact why they eat what they do. Next is food availability. This can impact what people eat as well. For example, if you live near the sea and seafood is very available to you and relatively inexpensive, because of that, you're more likely to eat seafood. Another example is today we have many places that are considered food deserts. So a food desert is a place where there is not a large supermarket or large grocery store. And those large supermarkets and grocery stores are where people can buy fruits and vegetables at low prices, whole grains at low prices, and low-fat milk at lower prices. So when there's not a supermarket or large grocery store available, we call that a food desert, and quick markets and convenience stores are really all that's available to the people that live there in close proximity. So that can make it difficult for them to buy these healthier foods, especially if there's also not a farmer's market or anything like that in their area. The foods at the quick markets and convenience stores are likely to be highly processed and have high sugar and high fat. So these food deserts are a big problem. That's related to food availability. Next subcategory under environment is cultural influences. So cultural influences are the knowledge and beliefs and customs that people have. And you can have many cultural influences. For example, if you grow up in a culture and then you move to another culture, you can have the influence of those two cultures on you. Or if you, say, live in the larger American culture, but you also are part of an ethnic group that has its own culture, you can be part of those two different cultures. So there can be multiple cultural influences or only one, depending on the person. And then we have religion as the next subcategory under environment. So religions have religious rites and symbols and customs, some of which involve food. They can also have dietary laws and restrictions. Major world religions include Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And within each of those major religions, there's smaller groups. And there's also religions that are none of those, but are also, there's many people that are practitioners of that religion, and those can also have different dietary restrictions and rules or customs as well. So those are the overarching influences on why we eat what we do. Next, we're going to define a nutrient. So first, let's take this definition directly from our book. Any substance in food that the body can use to obtain energy, synthesize tissues, or regulate functions. And you'll see down there at the bottom, I have a link to nutrition.gov. This is a website about food in general, and it has information about nutrients. Whenever I put a link in your slideshow, I'm trying to direct your attention to an outside resource that could be useful to you. Please know that I have no control over whether these sites change. Sometimes they change without my knowledge, and I'm not endorsing what's on them necessarily. I'm trying to get you to look at information that's available to consumers or professionals that is of public health relevance with nutrition. Sometimes there's a professional section, and there's usually a large consumer section. So this is the consumer section here, and this is intended for the general public. So if you would like to take a look at these, I do encourage you to do that. And there'll be several in this slideshow, and there'll be in other slideshows as well. So let's define a nutrient a different way. A nutrient is a chemical whose absence from the diet for a long enough time results in specific change in health, and usually that's a negative change. And when that happens, we say that the person has a deficiency of that nutrient, and that comes directly from your book, Discovering Nutrition by Incel. And we're going to be talking about some nutrient deficiencies in this course, but that can be a different way to understand what a nutrient is what happens when we don't have it. So next we're going to talk about what the nutrients are. They are carbohydrates, vitamins, lipids, proteins, minerals, and water. So there will be an entire section or an entire lecture on most of these nutrients. So I am basically trying to give you a summary today of the nutrients, but we will get way more detailed about their absorption and about how they are used in the body, what happens if we don't have them, etc., etc. So let's talk about next the social ecological model, which is in your book in chapter 1 of Discovering Nutrition. This is a framework for nutrition and physical activity decisions. And it's on the next slide, so I'm going to show that to you. As you can see, this is a visual representation of a lot of the things that we have been talking about influences and what people eat. So the visual representation helps us to understand these concepts better. Let's talk for a moment about the diet of people in the United States. So the book calls this the standard American diet, but by American, they mean the United States in this context. So what is it that we can say about the diet of the people in the United States? Well, it's diverse. It's as diverse as the people that are living here. So many in other parts of the world might believe that people in the United States always are eating hamburgers, hot dogs, potato chips, and French fries. And although there are large amounts of those consumed in the United States, the diet is actually far, far more diverse than that. So diversity is an important concept that's true of the diet and the people in the U.S. Also, the My Plate model is what we use to try to help people understand what they should be eating. It's one of the ways we do that. And the typical diet of people in the U.S. is not meeting the My Plate standard at all. It meets some of the My Plate standard in terms of certain nutrients, but not others. So overall, it's not meeting it. And one of the ways it's not meeting it is it has too much sodium. People are consuming too much sodium, mostly in processed foods. It also has too much sugar. It also does not have enough dietary fiber and does not contain enough fruits and vegetables. Let's talk for a moment about energy, because one of the major reasons we eat is to obtain energy. So energy can be defined as the capacity to do work. Carbohydrates, triglyceride, lipids, and protein give us energy. Alcohol can also provide us with energy, but it's not really considered a nutrient and we don't need to have it. Many people abstain from alcohol completely. And to measure energy in nutrition, we use kilocalories. So kilocalories is the measurement we use that is also called a calorie in commonplace language, but it is 1 kcal. You'll sometimes hear kcal instead of kilocalories. It's the same thing. 1 kcal is the amount of energy that will raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 centimeter. That's what it means. But you'll hear people say this food has 200 calories in it. And what they are really saying is it has 200 kilocalories or kcals. And this is the units of measure in nutrition. So how much energy is in foods? Well, if you have 1 gram of carbohydrate, you have 4 kcals, also called calories. If you have 1 gram of protein, that's 4 kcals. And if you have 1 gram of fat, that's 9 kcals. Also, alcohol has 7 kcals. As you can see, fat has the most kcals per gram. So moving forward in this introductory lecture, we're going to talk about the definition of health, because throughout the series of lectures, we're going to talk about how food impacts health. So it's important to understand what we mean when we say health. So the World Health Organization, or WHO, defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. What about disease? Because we're going to be talking about that concept in this lecture series as well. So disease is defined as an impairment of the normal state of the living animal or plant body or one of its parts that interrupts or modifies the performance of the vital functions. That's disease. It's interrupting this. That is from chapter 1 of Discovering Nutrition in Cell. So next we're going to have a little tribute to the scientific process. So if you have not studied the scientific process, it's going to be important for you to do that here in this class, because we're going to be talking about it throughout the class. You're going to be using it in your final project. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, please spend some time with your book and with other resources to try to make sure you understand it, and I'm happy to explain as well. So our textbook, chapter 1, has a good explanation of the scientific process. Now, what I mean by that is we form hypotheses, we experiment, we look at the observations that we get from the experiment, we make new and revised hypotheses, then we experiment again, and eventually we get observations from that, and eventually we get to substantiated hypothesis. So we can look at that and say, oh, what have we learned here? We got a substantiated hypothesis. We have some evidence to back that up based on science. So again, look at that in your book if you're not sure what I'm talking about. Also, there's an open access book that I've linked here that has some information about science and the scientific method and this kind of information about experiments and what kind of experiments have been done and can be done in nutrition. And you can actually click down here, types of scientific studies. So this is another resource. It's a little simpler if you want to start there if this is not something you're familiar with, but I suspect most people are familiar. There's another link there as well. So one of the things you would learn in the book and in the open access book I linked is about clinical trials, which are the gold standard when we're doing scientific research. But it's not always possible in nutrition to do a ethical research study with a clinical trial because it would be unethical and against the person's rights to have them eat a certain way or not eat a certain way just so you could learn what would happen. And we don't do that. So you can't always do a clinical trial. However, you can do something like correlation studies more easily. And correlation studies are when we look at a certain population of people and we say this is what they're eating, and then we see how the outcomes are, and we can draw a correlation between what they're eating and what the outcome is, but we can't say that the eating actually caused what the outcome is. So correlation is not causation, and that's important to remember. But the clinical trials are the gold standard, and in clinical trials we have a control group and an experimental group, and the control group is not exposed to whatever intervention we have, and the experimental group is, and then we compare their outcomes once they've been exposed to the intervention, and we look at the differences to try to find out more information about whatever the intervention was. There's also something called the placebo effect that we want to control for. We don't want the placebo effect to impact our data. So the placebo effect is like this. Let's say you were studying a drug to see if it was going to be effective, and you wanted to do that. So you used the gold standard, you used a clinical trial, and you had an intervention group, an experimental group, and that group was going to receive the actual intervention, right, the drug itself, and then you have another group that's the control group, and they don't get the medicine. They don't get that. But you need to have something that they take every day so they don't know that they're not getting the drug. So you give them what's called a placebo pill. And when you give them a placebo pill, it's usually sugar. It's just a sugar pill, and it's not expected to do anything. And so you do that to see if there's any difference, even though they don't know that they're not getting the drug. Because if you believe that this pill is going to work, then that can actually cause some change. And so we don't want that change to influence our data. So we do the placebo, we give them the sugar pill so that they don't know that they're not getting the drug. So when you do that, you're controlling for the placebo effect, that effect where someone can believe something's going to work and it does work to some extent just because they thought it would work. Then the best way to conduct a study beyond doing the control group and the experimental group and the intervention and the placebo, beyond just that, you want to double blind the study. And how you double blind the study is you say, the people that are doing this study are not going to know who's in which group. They're not going to know who's in the control group, and they're not going to know who's in the experimental group. They're not going to know. And the people in the study are also not going to know. So that's the double blinding. You blind the scientists and you blind the participants, and they cannot know which group they're in. And when you do that, you get the best data you could get, right? Because you've controlled for the placebo effect, and you've controlled for how the participants and or the scientists may behave. Because if you don't do that, the scientists may act different, unconsciously act different toward the control group or toward the experimental group. And when they act different, that could impact data. So when you double blind a study, that makes it even stronger. So again, if you are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, please see your book and it will help you to understand, and I'm happy to explain as well. So let's go to sifting facts and fallacies, because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of unscientific information that's out there on the internet and in other places that we see on a daily basis. And we want to try to make sure that we're evaluating that information so that we're making decisions based on good scientific info. And one of the ways we do that is we can look at where the information is coming from. So there are primary sources. Now, primary sources are professional journals in print and on the internet. And this is the scientific information. It's the primary source where the data has come from, where the analysis has come from. Those are your primary sources. So there is bias even with the primary source because there's some bias in everything. But the primary source has the least you can have. And if it's a well-done study, they've hopefully tried to control for bias and eliminate it as much as possible. And then when you get to your secondary source are scientific magazines with articles based on primary source material written by specialists, okay? So when you get to this level, you still have people that are knowledgeable, but you're introducing more bias because they're restating and summarizing what was in the primary source. They're telling you about the primary source. So you're going to have bias in that process. Then you get to the science writing level, and the science writing level is where generalist magazines and newspapers and science pages, they have articles in a section about science written by science writers. But again, you're to the next level where you've introduced even more bias from summarizing and restating. And then when you get to the mass media level, you have even more bias. This is the nightly news bites, the instant books, the unattributed internet sites. And at the mass media level, you've introduced even more bias. So we need to be aware of the process that's going on here and sifting facts and fallacies because more and more bias gets introduced. Information that could just be not correct could be at the mass media level, for example, that the primary source scientists would say, well, that is not at all what we meant because of the bias that has been introduced along the way. So this helps us to evaluate scientific information more carefully when we consider what level the information we're getting. Is it a primary, secondary, science writing, and mass media? Now, we're not saying that the primary source is the only place that you can get information because honestly, the primary sources are very difficult to understand if you're not an expert sometimes. So there's nothing wrong with secondary sources and science writing, etc., providing the information. And if we didn't have mass media getting the information out to the general public, then they wouldn't know about it at all. But it's important to recognize that when you get down to the mass media level, you are no longer dealing with people that truly understand the study usually and truly understands its strengths and weaknesses and how it fits into the larger context of what is known about the topic. You're dealing with the mass media and they're not aware of that, and they've introduced lots of bias along the way before it even got to the mass media level. So it's important to understand that when you're sifting through science information. So next we're going to talk about the red flags of junk science. So a red flag is something that makes you say, whoa, stop, hold on now. What's going on here? That's a red flag, okay? So red flags for junk science, meaning science is not really science, could be the following. A recommendation that promises a quick fix. If something is saying this is going to cure your cancer in 30 days, that is promising a very quick fix, okay? And that is probably junk science. Dire warnings of the danger from a single product or regimen. So usually single projects and regimens that are out there and they're super dangerous have been regulated away or they're no longer allowed to be sold. Now, it's not saying that everything out there is safe, but if there's a dire warning about a single product or regimen, it may be like a red flag that this information might be junk science. Do they have any evidence of that is the question. And then claims that sound too good to be true. When something sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So that's a red flag. Simplistic conclusions drawn from a complex study. So if this is a very complex study, maybe it's the women's health study that's been going on for decades, and they've had multiple different layers, and they've had several different interventions involved, and if there's a lot of complexity, then it's important to understand that the conclusions are probably going to have some complexity. And if they give you really simple conclusions, then they may not really understand the study, or this could be junk science and they just not, there's tons of bias involved. So when you see simplistic conclusions drawn from a complex study, that's a red flag. If you see recommendations based on a single study, well, you can have outlier studies. So when someone's basing their conclusions on a single study, then that's a red flag, because there could be dozens, decades worth of studies. There could be many studies, even hundreds of studies done on this topic. And if you have one study showing something, it could be completely different than what all of the other evidence says. So that is a red flag if there's only one study to back this up. Statements refuted by reputable scientific organizations. So if you have a statement that says, protein is bad for you, you should never eat protein, that is a red flag, because that statement is refuted by reputable scientific organizations. First of all, protein is essential to health. You have to eat it in order to be healthy. Your body can't function without some protein. But, someone can make that claim. And so if the statement is refuted by reputable scientific organizations, the American Dietetic Association, the American Medical Association, and many other organizations are saying, no, you need protein to survive, then that's a red flag. List of good or bad foods. Now, sometimes this is just a shortcut to education, but if they're listing these foods are always good, these foods are always bad, that can be a red flag, because, that's very simplistic, very simplistic. Recommendations made to help sell a product. So what's the motivation when someone is trying to sell a product? If the motivation is to sell the product, that's a form of bias that could definitely impact the recommendation that they're making. So you always want to think about what the motivations are, and there could be a red flag for junk science if they're trying to sell you a product. Recommendations based on studies that are not peer-reviewed. So a peer-reviewed journal is a journal that's reviewed by people that are also scientists at the same level, and they are only putting into the journal what they deem to be good science in their field, in their specific discipline, and they are people that fully understand the discipline. So if the recommendation that is being given is based on studies that are not peer-reviewed, then that could be a red flag that it's junk science, particularly if it contradicts what is in the journals that are peer-reviewed. And then lastly, recommendations from studies that ignore differences among individuals and groups could be junk science, because they're ignoring some really important factors if they're not looking at the differences among individuals and groups, because there are differences, and we want to always take those into account when we're doing scientific work. Next, we're going to talk about the core nutrition concepts. So then core nutrition concepts are very important to understand. They are adequacy, balance, calorie control, nutrient density, moderation, and variety. So you can go to myplate.gov if you would like to learn more information about the guidelines that we have to help people make good food choices, and learn about the core nutrition concepts. So adequacy is making sure you have an adequate diet. That means that the foods you choose to eat provide you with all of the essential nutrients, fiber, and energy, an amount sufficient to support growth and maintain health. So many Americans consume more calories than they need, but they're not getting 100% of the recommended intakes for a number of nutrients. And so adequacy is a major concern. We need to make sure people are getting an adequate diet. Next, we have balance. A healthful diet requires a balance of a variety of foods: grains, vegetables, fruits, oil, milk, and meat and beans, energy sources like carbohydrates, protein, and fats, and other nutrients like vitamins and minerals. Your diet can also be balanced in a complementary way when you have foods and choose foods to eat that provide you with adequate nutrients. The trick is to consume enough but not too much from all the different food groups. And in that way, you will be, it will help you to have balance, and that also helps you with adequacy as well. Next, we have calorie control. So calorie control is an issue. For many years, research supported the idea that weight loss and subsequent weight maintenance relied on energy balance, which is the net difference between energy intake and energy expenditure. But current research is challenging these simplistic mathematical equations of calories versus in versus calories out, and focusing more on diet composition overall, rather than just total calories. So calorie control is very important. It's a much more complex concept than we imagined. You should demand value for your expenditures in your monetary budget. A limited amount of money to spend on things such as food, rent, books, and transportation is a given. And in that sense, we all have a calorie budget as well. Every time you eat, you are choosing to spend some of your calorie budget for the day, your total calories for the day. And those who spend their budget wisely tend to be healthier than those who do not. So let's take the concept of calorie control together with nutrient density and see how that works, because nutrient density is our next core concept. So nutrient density is the ratio of nutrient content to energy content. A measurement helps to determine how healthy a food is. So when you think of low nutrient density foods, think about junk food, things like potato chips. They don't have many nutrients in them, such as vitamins and minerals, right? But they have lots and lots of calories. A food that is nutrient dense may have calories, but those calories give you some minerals and give you some vitamins. It gives you some of the things you need very badly. If you have a food that just has a ton of calories, well, it doesn't have any of that, then that's not a nutrient dense food. And we want to emphasize nutrient density in our diet so that we can get all of the nutrients we need for the day and without consuming too many calories for our needs. And next we have moderation. Moderation is a very important concept because we don't want to have too much or too little. That's what moderation means. Moderation does not mean that you have to eliminate low nutrient foods completely from your diet, such as soft drinks and candy and potato chips, but rather that you can include them occasionally. You can eat them in moderation. So we don't really talk about foods being all bad, that you can never have them. We say you need moderation if the food is a low nutrient dense food. Next, we have variety. Variety is important for a number of reasons. Eating a variety of fruits, for example, provides you with a broader mix of vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals than if you eat just the same fruit over and over again or two fruits most of the time. So choosing a variety of protein sources gives you a different balance of fats and other nutrients. So variety is really, really important to make sure you have a good diet. It can add interest and excitement to your meals and prevent boredom. People get very bored when they eat the same thing all the time. And perhaps most importantly, variety in your diet helps to ensure that you get all the nutrients you need. And studies have shown that people who have a varied diet are more likely to meet their overall nutritional needs and have a healthy weight and whatnot. So they just have a healthier body, a healthier diet, and a healthier life. So variety is really, really important. And if you want to visit myplate.gov, you'll learn about how we're trying to teach people to eat a healthy diet, and you can see that this My Plate involves eating a variety of foods. It involves balance. It doesn't talk about adequacy so much on here, but it does within the content of the nutritional information talk more about balance if you keep clicking. And it talks about moderation because it's trying to get you to do portion control. Although the My Plate doesn't really tell you how much of each thing you're supposed to eat, if you click around in the information here on the website, you would find some information about that. because this educational information is going to try to encourage an overall healthy diet. See here, they're trying to address economics with budget-friendly food ideas. This is a My Plate plan. You can actually create your own plan. So this is public health at work, public health information out there for the consumer, out there for Americans to use. Got some apps, and you can go under various parts of this to look at more. You can click on each food group, help people understand what are grains, why do we need to eat them, how much is a portion of grains. So there you get the idea. Okay. So energy is a slide that's in here again because we want to review that one reason we eat is to obtain energy, and energy is the capacity to do work. So when we're eating, we have to keep all this in mind and remember that each of the nutrients that gives us energy has a specific amount of energy it gives per gram, and that can help us calculate how much energy we're getting from that food so that we can compare that to how much energy we need. So what do the guidelines for Americans say? They say a healthy diet should be consumed all your life, and you want to eat a variety of foods, have appropriate nutrient density, meaning high nutrient density, and have the proper amount of the foods. You want to limit calories from added sugar and saturated fats, and you want to reduce sodium intake because everyone is eating too much salt, basically. You want to shift to healthier foods and beverages from less healthy ones, and you want to support healthy eating patterns for all, not just yourself, but for other people as well. Now, we have the dietary reference intakes, or DRIs. So the dietary reference intakes are intended to help us eat a healthy diet. This is how we're going to measure how much we need, how much is too much of various nutrients. And we don't have every dietary reference intake for every single nutrient, but we do have information to help us make choices. So the first one we're going to talk about is the RDA, and it's probably the one that is most familiar to people. So the RDA is the nutrient intake level that is sufficient to meet the needs of 97 to 98% of the individuals in a life stage and gender group. The RDA is calculated from the EAR, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So the RDA is most likely to be on, say, a supplement label. If you're looking at a vitamin supplement label, it's going to have the RDA for that vitamin. The UL is the tolerable upper intake level, and it's the maximum level of a daily nutrient intake that poses little risk of adverse health effects to almost all of the individuals in a defined group. In most cases, supplements must be consumed to reach the UL. So the UL is really going to tell you what could be dangerous for you, okay? It's going to tell you that. And you usually have to get like a mega dose. You have to get supplements. You have to take supplements and or combine that with a food high in that nutrient in order to get to this level, this dangerous level. And then we have the AI, which is based on expert estimates of nutrient intake by a defined group of healthy people. These estimates are used when there is insufficient scientific evidence to establish an EAR. The AI is not equivalent to an RDA. And so when we don't have an RDA or an EAR, we will have an AI often, and the AI can help guide us. And then the EAR is the estimated average requirement. It is the nutrient intake level established to meet the needs of 50% of individuals in a life stage or gender group. So these dietary reference intakes can really help us make choices about our diet every day. What information can you find on a food label? There's a lot of information on a food label today. Some of that information is ingredients and basic information. There will be an ingredients list, and also there will be information about allergens that's present in the food. There's certain allergens that are required, that the manufacturers are required to say whether that allergen is in the food. But there's a ingredients list of everything, and then at the bottom it'll say this food contains, and it'll have the allergen. There's also the nutrition facts panel, and you'll have a nutrition facts panel food label, and this is what that looks like. Then you'll have the daily values, which are contained on that label, and we're going to talk about those on the next slide. And then you'll have nutrient content claims on some labels, health claims, or structure function claims. And if you want to, you can visit the nutrition facts label information, and it'll tell you about how to read a nutrition facts label. So here's the nutrition facts panel food label, and you see here that it tells us how many calories are in the food. It tells us the total fat. It tells us the percent daily value, and that is going to be based on a 2,000 calorie diet. They choose a 2,000 calorie diet because many people need 2,000 calories. If you need more or you need less, you have to make adjustments if you need more or less. It tells us about how much cholesterol is in the food, how much saturated and trans fats are in the food, and then total fat, sodium, total carbohydrate, and then dietary fiber, total sugars, added sugars, protein. So this is a lot of good information. This is an example of an ingredients list, and you can see here it has the actual ingredients, and then it has contains wheat, because this food contains wheat. And then it may contain milk, eggs, soy, and tree nuts. That's probably because those were manufactured in the same facility or nearby. And then it's important to understand that there are rules about what a label can claim. Labels, there's been abuse over time of what food manufacturers were putting on a label, and then other entities, agencies felt that this was misleading to the public. And so they've made rules about what you can and cannot put on a food label. So, for example, these claims that they can put on a food label, nutrient content claims. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, or NLEA, and the associated FDA regulations allow food manufacturers to make food content claims using a variety of scripted terms on labels, such as low fat, high fiber. And those are regulated. They can't just say them. They have to be able to prove that what they're saying. And this came from, like, remember when I talked about the 1980s and things were saying low fat, no fat? There was a lot of confusion about what those meant sometimes, and so we had to define what they meant and define it in a way that was fair to the consumer so that they would really understand. It would be misleading, for example, to print cholesterol-free on a can of vegetable shortening, a food that is 100% fat and high in saturated fat and trans fats like vegetable shortening. If it has a cholesterol-free label, that's really not what the consumer that wants cholesterol-free products is looking for, a high fat with trans fats in it. They're not looking for high fat with trans fats foods. So it would be misleading to put that on a label. And this is the kind of thing that's been regulated so that the consumer is not misled. Then you have health claims. So with the passage of the NLEA, manufacturers were allowed to add health claims to the label. And a health claim is a statement that links one or more dietary components to a reduced risk of disease, such as a claim that calcium reduces the risk of osteoporosis. Before the NLEA was passed, products making such claims were considered drugs, not foods. And drugs are regulated a lot more strictly than foods. So a health claim must be supported by scientifically valid evidence for it to be approved to use on a food label. Regulations require a finding of significant scientific agreement, which is a pretty high standard, before the FDA may authorize a new health claim. In addition, there are specific criteria for the use of the claims. So there's quite a few claims that have been approved at this point. An example of the standard that's being applied is a high fiber food that is also high in fat is not eligible for a health claim because, kind of misleading to the consumer who wants the fiber and then they don't really realize that there's all this fat in it. So the government won't let them claim the high fiber and then, have this high fat content. So far, the FDA has approved quite a few statements, maybe about a dozen, 16 or so. And here's an example. Dietary fat and cancer. They could say, low-fat diets may reduce the risk for some types of cancer. So they can put that on a low-fat food. Now, the low-fat has to also meet the criteria for what low-fat means, because that has a definition. Another one would be folate and neural tube defects. Adequate folate intake prior to and early in pregnancy may reduce the risk of neural tube defects, a birth defect. So they're allowed to say that on the label if appropriate, if they have followed all of the rules. What about soy protein and CHD? Foods rich in soy protein as part of a low-fat diet may help reduce the risk of heart disease. Okay, so they can make that claim if they're following all the rules. Fruits and vegetables and cancer. Maybe they could make this claim. Diets low in fat and rich in fruits and vegetables may reduce the risk of certain cancers. Okay, so these are the kind of claims they can put on the label if they're following all the regulations and rules set forth by the NLEA and the FDA. So let's talk about structure and function claims. So food labels may contain structure and function claims that describe potential effects of a food component, or dietary supplement component on body structures or functions such as bone health, muscle strength, and digestion. As long as the label does not claim to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease, a manufacturer can claim that a product helps promote immune health, for example, or it helps reduce the risk of heart disease. Currently, structure and function claims on food labels must be related to the food's nutritional value. Many scientists are concerned about the lack of consistent scientific standard for both health claims and structure and function claims. So there's quite a bit of controversy about these, but the structure and function claim, if you're a little bit confused about the health claim versus the structure and function claim, there is some controversy here. The structure and function claims are the statements that claim a benefit related to nutrient deficiency diseases, like vitamin C prevents scurvy, or describe a role of the nutrient or dietary ingredient intended to affect the structure or function of humans, such as calcium helps to build strong bones. So health and structure and function claims are related. So I'd like to thank you for participating in this lecture today. I would definitely encourage you to look at the textbook and look at the assignments and do those assignments to make sure you get all of your points. Make sure you turn in your notes because that's one of your assignments starting next week. You do not have to turn any notes in for this week, and I wish you well. Thank you.